Okay, thank you everyone for joining. It means a lot that you'd all come here to learn with me. And hello, Isaac, nice to see you. First I'm going to share my screen, and this is my first time doing this in a while. So please let me know if something's not working. You guys can see that? Okay, good. So this is the first in a series that I'm going to be doing on different intellectual battles or theological wars that were engaged sometimes between Jews and other Jews, sometimes between Jews and non-Jews, and sometimes that distinction wasn't so clear. But nevertheless, this is a series on fights that Jews had among themselves. And I'm not muted. No, I'm not. You can hear me good. So this is a history of the intellectual battles, and I think they're really interesting. Now, the linchpin, what I'm going to use to construct this entire series, are a series of books which are called Milchamos Hashem, or Wars for the Lord. There have been over a dozen of those books written, and that's really interesting in and of itself, that there are certain books that come up and certain titles that come up over and over again that have the same title, and those books are very interesting, and they come up in almost every single century from the 10th century until the 20th century. So I believe that if you know the background of those books, you have a pretty good idea of a lot of the tensions and battles the Jews were fighting, at least the intellectual battles that Jews were fighting amongst each other, not necessarily the physical struggles, but the intellectual struggles. Now, intellectual struggles are no joke, right? As we know today with a lot of the anti-Semitism that often doesn't take physical form, but it does take intellectual or written form. It's a very serious problem. It's not something to be laughed off. It's a very serious deal that you have to deal with, and Jews have been dealing with these kinds of things for a very, very long time. So we're going to start with the beginning, and this is with the Karaites and the Rabbanites. Now, the way I want to do this is to begin with an analysis of Jewish books in general. See, Jews have always been very literate, and we have here the list, or at least a very partial list of books written before Sajagon. So first, at the very top, we have the Mishnah, which was a bunch of rabbinic teachings, disputes, arguments back and forth on various halachic ideas, and in very few cases, certain theological ideas that were all put together by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi around the year 200. And around the same time, there's a parallel work called the Tosefta, which never took off as much as the Mishnah did. But nevertheless, it's many of the same rabbis talking about many of the same things, and that's another work written at the same time. Then we have the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli. These are the discussions that are happening about the Mishnah most of the time, and other statements that were recorded from the same rabbis. And these are discussions happening in Israel, happening in certain places in Bavel, and we'll discuss where. And these are all recorded and become the Talmud Bavli and the Yerushalmi. At the same time that these books are written, we have various midrashim. You have halachic midrashim like the Mechilta, the Sifri on various books of the Torah. There's not a parallel one on Bereshis, because Bereshis has very few psukim in the way of halacha. Then we have the Midrashei Agadah, or the more legendary books, which have very interesting and sometimes very strange stories that we're going to talk about, at least some of them, such as Seder Olam Rabbah, Midrash Tanchuma, Avos Rabbi Nassan, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, Tanit V'Eliyahu, and many other such works. Finally, we have what we might call the Kabbalistic, or the early Kabbalistic literature, in the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a Jewish book on the creation of the world, which doesn't once reference Sefer Bereshis, or the creation story in the Torah itself, which itself is very interesting. We have Shir Koma, which is a book which talks about the dimensions of God. Literally, it says that God's arm is such and such many amos long, and the legs are this many amos long, and so on and so forth. And we have the Hechalot literature, which is very strange, and it describes these rabbis who ascend various levels the heavenly realm, and they see different angels, and they see parts of God, and they see the throne of glory, and they see these things. So this is all the literature and all the kinds of things that are written before Sajagon, and why I chose that as the date to discuss the books before will become clear hopefully in a bit. But the idea is like this: in every single generation, Jews have described different kinds of groups of people or individual Jews who had different odd or heretical opinions. So going back as early as the Mishnah, which as we saw before was the very top of our list, the very first book over there. Even in the Mishnah, we have some reference of Jews that are arguing or doing strange things. So the Mishnah in Megillah as follows. Ha'omer eni over lifnei teva b'tzvuim. If someone says they don't want to get up and daven for the Amud wearing colored clothing, af bilvanim lo ya'avor. We don't even let him get up wearing white clothing. So if someone is insistent they only want to daven in white clothing as a chazan, we don't let them, not even while they're wearing white clothing. B'sandal eni over. If I don't want to get up wearing shoes, af yachif lo ya'avor. We don't even let them daven barefoot. And likewise, ha'oseh tfilaso agula, if someone has round tefillin, which there are pictures of different groups in Asia that actually have things that look very much like round tefillin, which is very interesting. That's a sakana, the Mishnah says. It's dangerous. Ve'ein ba mitzvah. There's no mitzvah that you fulfill by doing that. Nisana al mitzcho or al pas yado, if a person wants to put tefillin on their forehead, literally between their eyes, as the Torah says, between your eyes, or on the palm of their hand, the Torah says al yadecha, on your hand. Harezo derech minus. That's heresy. That's the way of heresy. Or tzipan zahav unasana al beis unkli shelo. If a person wants to cover their tefillin in gold or put them over their sleeve, harezo derech achitonim. Those are external ways. Those are not ways that we are appropriate towards tefillin as Jewish people. So what's going on here? Well, these people that the Mishnah is describing aren't around anymore, and we don't really have their literature to discuss. So we don't know who they were. But one thing that's really interesting is that at least for the first two, the people who wanted to wear white clothing and who wanted to walk barefoot, they wanted to daven in the same way that Kohanim would serve in the Beis HaMikdash. So whether that has any parallel, because Kohanim used to wear white clothing and they weren't allowed to wear shoes in the Beis HaMikdash. So even back then, tefillah was known to reflect things they used to do in the Beis HaMikdash, and they wanted to adopt that custom as well. But the Mishnah said, we don't do that anymore. And that's unacceptable. So it's clearly describing some kinds of heretical groups. And the Mishnah goes on, but I think we get the idea. Similar in Masechet Sanhedrin, very famously, the Mishnah here talks about more ideas that are heretical. So these are the people, or the groups of people who don't have a share in the world to come. If someone says that Chias HaMesim is not found, there's no resurrection discussed in the Torah, the Ein Torah Meshemayim, where Torah was not written by God, but Bikaros, or someone is some kind of heretic, they don't have a share in the world to come. So these are obviously ideas and possibly whole groups of Jews that were believing these kinds of things. But the Mishnah is saying that these are sectarian, heretical beliefs, and these don't have a share in the world to come. But the point is that these are people that are around that are arguing against the rabbinic, the rabbis, even at the time of the Mishnah. There's a slightly later source, one more that we'll discuss. Famous Mishnah by Antignos Ish Socho from Maseches Avos. It says, Al tiyu ka'avadim hamishamshin es harav al menas lekabel pras. Don't be like servants who serve the rabbi, or who serve the master, rather, which is referring to God, in order that they should receive a reward. Be like servants who worship or serve their master without the expectation of receiving the reward. And Rambam's version of this mission, by the way, makes it even more explicit. He has that be like servants who worship, who serve their master, on the condition that they don't receive any reward. So that's an even sharper idea in the same vein, that and this is a message that we should be doing mitzvos not in order to get any specific reward, but because we recognize inherent value in them in and of itself. So a very famous midrash on this Mishnah from Avos Rabbi Nassan, that Shtei Talmidim Hayulo, that Antignos had these two students. Tzadok Ubaitus. Those are the names of his two students. V'kivan sheshamu as hadavar hazeh shanu l'talmidehem. When they heard this teaching of their Rebbe, they taught it over to their students. B'talmidehem amru davar mipi rabban v'lo amru perusha. Their students said over this teaching from the rabbi, but they didn't say what it meant. And amru lahen, they said, ilu hayisam yaduam shitches hamesim matan scharan shel tzadikim lasid lavo. If they knew that there was a resurrection of the dead and there was some kind of reward for tzadikim in the end of days, hayu omrim came. They would have said that. So they went and they believed that based on this teaching of Antignos Isocho, that there's no reward for mitzvos. And because of this, because the Tzadok and Baitus didn't teach that explanation that really there is reward for mitzvos, but you just shouldn't do the mitzvos in that way, then halchu pershu lahen v'yotzeh mehem shtei mishpachos tzdukim and baitusim. They went and they created two whole families or two whole sects, the tzdukim and the baitusim. And tzdukim l'shem tzadok or baitusim l'shem baitus. So they had the tzdukim, the Sadducees, after the name of Tzadok, and Baitusim after the name of Baitus. So really, according to this Midrash, Tzadok and Baitus didn't necessarily do anything wrong themselves. They only didn't explain the meaning of what Antignos said. And because of that, it created a schism of people who didn't believe that there was any reward for mitzvahs. But the point I want to bring from this is that even back then, in the Mishnah times, in the Talmud times, in the Midrashic times, they're discussing these different heretical groups that are arguing against the rabbis. Now, back to the chain we spoke about here. From the Mishnah to the Tosefta to the Talmud, all of these things are being written and discussed in yeshivas and in centers of learning throughout Israel, throughout Bavel, and specifically in three places. We have in Jerusalem and in a few other places in Israel are different rabbis who are discussing these things and writing them down and creating whole works of Jewish literature. And then we have Pumbedisa and Sura. And these are the two seats where two giant yeshivas come up. And over there, these are the rabbis and their students are discussing the Mishnah, they're discussing the Gemara, and this is where this literature is being born. And into this literature, we have the entire Jewish culture. So Pumbedisa and Sura right along the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so this is near modern day Iraq. And at this time, there are, as we said, there are different groups of people who are heretical or arguing against the rabbis at that time. And given that the rabbis of the Talmud are the basic status quo, what we end up seeing is that the people who are heretical, the people who are arguing against the rabbis, always target these very specific things about the status quo. And there are five basic categories which define a sectarian group. The first thing is that they reject the Talmud. The Talmud is the main text of the Jewish tradition at that point. So they reject the Talmud, they reject the oral law. The second thing is that they reject the religious leaders. The third thing is that they have this very strong desire to bring about the Messianic age and the end of the religion as it was at that point. And the fourth thing is that they engage in an incredible form of asceticism, where they take on fast and they start whipping themselves and wearing uncomfortable clothing and all these kinds of things. And the fifth thing is that they have an opposition to forms of economic equality. So they're targeting the elites in five very serious ways. They're targeting the rabbinic elite in the Talmud, and also in their rejection of religious leaders. They're targeting the economic elites and saying that we want more economic freedom, more economic equality. And these groups of people are not very well defined. They're very different and many different kinds of people in there. But nevertheless, they all have these five things in common, where they are targeting the status quo and they're attempting to bring it down. So slowly but surely, these different groups of people come together and they take on the name of Karaites. Now, before the Karaites, there's one person that we have to talk about, and that is someone who the Karaites took on and as one of their own, as their founder, and his name was Anan ben David. And Anan ben David, there are at least four different accounts of how he came to be. So one of the accounts was written by a Karaite. That's the first one, Al-Kirkisani, and the other three were written by rabbis. So you can kind of tell already what spin they're going to give on this. But these are the four earliest accounts we have, and we have to take them. We really don't have anything better to judge who he was or what he did. But the first one, according to Al-Kirkisani, this Anan ben David was a very learned Rabbinite. He was a rabbinic scholar, and not one of the rabbis could say anything against his incredible knowledge and wisdom. And the rabbis, because he was causing trouble for them, the rabbis tried to assassinate him, but God prevented them from doing so. So it's very basic, very simple, but that's the picture we get from Al-Kirkisani. Then from Amran Gaon goes has a little bit of a different opinion. He says that there are certain people at the time of the Natronai Gaon, who was about a century earlier, they were trying to modify or change the Pesach Seder, and they became the scholars of Anan, of this person, Anan ben David we were talking about. And he told all of them to forsake the words of the Mishnah and the words of the Talmud, and that he would compose a new Talmud for them. And there we go. And he composed a new Talmud for himself, and he called it the Sefer HaMitzvos. And there is a book by Anan ben David called the Sefer HaMitzvos, which does differ quite a bit from what the rabbis were doing in the Mishnah. But that's a second version of what Anan was doing. A more detailed one by, we don't know who wrote it, but probably not, but it's possibly written by Sajagon, where he says that the basic difference between Anan and the rabbis happened because Anan was promised, or was not promised, but was expecting to be appointed as the exilarch or the Reish Galusa. So at this time in Jewish history, there were two or three main Jewish positions of power. One was known as the Gaon. The Gaon was the head of the yeshivas that we spoke about here in Pumbedisa and Sura. They had the Gaonim, they were the heads of the yeshiva. And then the political leader was known as the Reish Galusa. He's the one who used to collect the Jewish taxes and the ones who would bring the petitions of the Jews to the king or to the rulers. And Anan ben David thought that he was going to be the one to get that position. But instead, according to this source, the rabbis saw that he was was a very wicked person and he lacked piety, and therefore they gave it to his younger brother. And because of this, Anan got very upset and he set up another sect of Judaism, and this new sect of Judaism appointed Anan as their own political leader. And this was a serious problem because this was creating factions and divisions in the Jewish nation. And because of this, it goes on to say that Anan was thrown in jail and that he ended up bribing the Muslim rulers, and that's how he got out of jail, and he started writing his books and creating all these problems. But that's the third source of what we know about Anan ben David. And the fourth one from Avraham ibn Daud is very similar to that one. It's much abridged, but the same idea comes along, that Anan was vying for the position of Reish Galusa. He didn't get it, and because of that, he started spreading all his heresy and created all these problems and really took down or made a big blow to the Mishnah. So that's the story of Anan ben David. So why is he important? Well, he began these groups of sectarian Jews, or at least continued in that tradition of Jews who were arguing against the mainstream status quo rabbis at the time, and these groups of Jews slowly but surely became the Karaites. Now, the word Karaite, by the way, is one of three opinions as what it could possibly mean. It either comes from the word mikra in Hebrew, which means readers, because they only follow the written Torah, not the oral Torah, or it could come from the word kara, also Hebrew, which means callers, or in other words, missionaries, because they used to call out to other Jews and try to get them to reject the Talmud and to join their own group. It could also come from the Arabic word karaun, which means an expert reader of scripture, of Tanakh. So similar to mikra, the same kind of word. Now, Sajagon is going to become the most important person we're going to discuss here, who is not a Karaite. He had a very, very interesting history, much of which we can't get into now. He really began his importance in the Jewish community with a dispute with Aaron ben Meir. There was the leader of the Jews in Israel, this Rabbi Aaron ben Meir. He wanted to change the Jewish calendar, which would mean that in Israel, they would have Pesach on a different day than Jews in the rest of the world. And Sajagon wrote a whole series of letters about this and a very strongly worded document against this. And because of this, almost all the Jews in the world followed the Sajid calendar, even the Jews in Israel. And Sajid basically saved the rabbinic Jews from splitting into various factions regarding the calendar. Because of this, the rabbis in Babylon were so impressed that they appointed Sajid to be the Gaon of one of the yeshivas, even though he himself wasn't descended from any other Gaonim, and he didn't have any great lineage in that regard, but they were so impressed with him as a person that they appointed him to that position. Then the dispute with David ben Zakkai, who was at that point the Reish Galusa, who had appointed him to the position. They had various arguments about certain corruptions that Saadia Gaon said that David ben Zakkai was engaging in. And because David ben Zakkai was not too happy about this, he appointed another Gaon in Saadia's place, which was unprecedented. A Gaon was usually an appointment for life. And because of this, Saadia Gaon fought back. And he said, no, you don't get to, you appointed a new Gaon, I'm going to appoint a new Reish Galusa. And they kind of had this back and forth, and this was another serious battle between Saadia Gaon. And that was his personality. He was very, very smart, extremely well written. He wrote Emunus V'Deos, one of the most important Jewish philosophy books to this very day. He wrote commentaries on many books of the Bible. He wrote a commentary on the 13 Midos that the Talmud uses to extract halacha from psukim. He wrote a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, works of Hebrew grammar, many different books of halacha, shuvos. He wrote a poem on the 613 mitzvos, where he explains the 613 mitzvos in a poetic verse, and many other polemical works. But that's his personality. He's this incredibly intellectual, really smart individual, but at the same time, he doesn't really have the ability to let attacks sit. If somebody attacks him, you know that he will strike back, and sometimes he will attack even if he wasn't attacked first. Now, this is where our story begins, because up to this point, if we've been following the story, there were Karaites floating around who were going from different communities, but they're very dispersed. They're a very diverse group of people. They don't really agree on anything. In fact, Al-Kirkisani even writes that the Karaites, you can hardly find one topic in which they all agree. And by and large, they don't really get any converts. After Anan ben David, we don't really find any person who they claim was a rabbinic figure who converted and became a Karaite. We don't really find such things. So they're sort of marginal in Jewish history. But Saadia Gaon, with his very, not necessarily temperamental or oppositional personality, but something close to it, he writes very vigorously against this group of Karaites. Even though they're very small and really aren't making that big an impact in the Jewish people and are somewhat marginal, in his introduction to his tafsir, which is his commentary and translation of the Torah into Arabic, he gives 7 different reasons why it's necessary that a written law or a Torah Shebachsav will have an oral law, or Torah Sheba'al Peh. And this is this is a direct attack against the Karaites. So what we find is anu motziim b'mitzvos. We find in the mitzvos shiva dvarim ikarim hamaskikim osanu ala kabbalah. There's 7 things that imply the existence of a kabbalah or a tradition. In this case, kabbalah means an oral tradition. The first 4 kind of summarize into the same basic point. Mipnei sheyesh b'torah mitzvos she'echi yosehen lo nisparshu lanu. There are mitzvos in the Torah which their specific details are not explained very well. There's certain values or quantities which are not explained regarding certain mitzvahs, such as how much tzedakah one has to give, or how much of a truma and meiser one has to give. There are certain mitzvahs which we wouldn't know how to recognize them without an oral tradition. We wouldn't know how to establish the month, for example. When is Rosh Chodesh? If we didn't have an oral tradition, that's nowhere described in the Chumash. And finally, she'etzem mahusam lo nisparsha. There's certain mitzvos that their basic essence is not even explained at all. The 39 malachos are, some are explained in the Torah, but most of them are completely absent. So that's very important to know, because if one breaks Shabbos at some point, in some process in Jewish history, the punishment is to be put to death. So knowing how to understand what these 39 malachos are is extraordinarily important, and yet it's completely absent from the Torah. Those are the first four. The mitzvos are not sufficiently explained by the written text itself. The fifth reason he gives is mirpnei she'ha'uma maskima. The entire nation agrees. She'Hashem yisbarach hitil aleha mitzvos. That God has given us certain mitzvos shelo nizkiru b'Torah shmoseihen, that weren't even mentioned by name in the Torah. The kol shekain kam yosein ve'ech yosein, and all the more so, there's specific details. So tefillah, for example, that we have to daven to God, is nowhere mentioned in the Torah, and so that's his fifth reason. Some mitzvos that we all agree are mitzvos are not mentioned in the Torah. We only know them from an oral tradition. Number 6, that the toldos hashanim va'maisim mizman shepasku navim ad zmanim yuzad. The most interesting to me, the most interesting reason that Sadi gives is that the stories of the years, the history of all the things that happened from the time that the Nevi'im ended, from the end of the Bible until his own day, this is something which we wouldn't know about except through means of tradition. That history can only be known through some kind of an oral tradition, which is kind of true. As a historian, there's no real empirical verifiable facts. History is not a science in the same way that chemistry or biology is. We kind of accept certain things because someone alive at the time wrote it. And that's, in some sense, an oral, a record of an oral tradition. So that's a sixth answer. To me, that's the most interesting one. And finally, 7, and what we know that God will do for us at the end of days, it's called tikva, that we wouldn't know about the things that give us a certain hope or dream of things that will happen at the end of days with the Mashiach, with Chias HaMesim, ela im tismach al perish b'alei Kabbalah, except by the fact that we rely on the words of the Bavli Kabbalah, of the people recording this tradition. So these are the 7 reasons, and Sadigon writes many other things against the Karaites, most of which we don't have anymore today, but he wrote extensively against this very small and insignificant group calling themselves the Karaites. And at this point, we wonder, what would have happened had Sadia never done this? Would they have still been around today? Because there are still Karaites around today. And ironically, and something that Sadia might not have expected, is that by him writing these strong attacks against the Karaites, he created the incentive and the necessity for all the diverse and arguing groups and different groups of Karaites to have a stronger sense of unity, and for them to develop a strong intellectual response to Sajigon, who was, as I said, brilliant intellectual and really very sharp in his criticisms against the Karaites and sharp across the board. So Sajigon created the necessity for the Karaites to develop this incredible body of literature, which they did between the 9th or the 10th and the 12th centuries, and even after. There was a book written in 1904 where this a scholar went through all the books that were written by Karaites against Sajigon, and in every single century, there are many, many, many books written by Karaites against Sajigon. In some sense, Sajigon, by attacking them, created Karaism throughout history. So it's a really interesting irony, but nevertheless, this is how it went. So now we get into the book of Milchamos Hashem that we're talking about here, because one of the people who wrote against Sajigon was a Karaite named Salmon ben Yeruchim, or Yerocham in the Hebrew version, Shlomo ben Yerocham, and his book that he wrote, Milchamos Hashem, is I think very aptly described as wretched rhymes. It's very beautifully written, really incredible language and beautiful poetry. It's written in a very angry, very nasty, attacking manner. And in some senses, he treats Sajigon like a personal enemy. And I'll show you, we'll look at some examples of what I mean by that in a moment. There's a chiastic structure to the book. So the rhymes begin, every 4 lines begins with another letter of the alphabet. So it goes Aleph to Bet to Gimel to Dalet all the way down to Taf. And then in the next chapter, it starts at Taf and it goes Taf to Shin to Resh and all the way back up, back to Aleph. And it goes back and forth over a dozen times like that. So it's not a long book, but it's a very long poem. and it's really written very beautifully. We have the version written in Hebrew. He claimed to have written another version in Arabic, but if he ever did, we no longer have it. In one of the versions, and this is one of the most interesting facts about this, someone wrote that this is the poem written by Salmon ben Yerucham against Sadia, his rebellious student. So was Salmon ben Yerucham actually Sadia Gaon's teacher? There's another tradition, another Karaite tradition that they have that when Salmon ben Yerucham died, Sadia followed after the casket, and when they buried him in the ground, he stood up and he gave a eulogy for his fallen critic. Is this true? Almost certainly not. We know that Salmon ben Yerucham was alive and doing things for a few decades after Sadia Gaon died, and was much younger than Sadia Gaon. It's very unlikely that he was ever Sadia Gaon's teacher. It's not necessarily even the case that they ever met. And one of the possibilities for why he wrote with such vehemence against Sadia Gaon was because he wanted to get Sadia Gaon to respond to him, and that would have been very good for his standing among the other Karaites. So in this book, he has 15 claims against the Mishnah and the oral law, some of which we will talk about. So in terms of the wretched rhymes, he really has very angry attacks against Sadia Gaon. So for example, from the first chapter, we have, I want to recognize my friend Shawn just came in, who is a current practicing Karaite. Later, if there anyone who wants to stay on for questions, I asked him and he agreed. If anyone wants to ask me or him any questions, he'll have some answers that I won't have. I am by no means an expert on Karaite history or modern Karaites, but he'll be able to answer some questions if anybody wants to ask them. So in the first chapter of Mechamos Hashem, we have one of the rhymes, really beautiful poetry. So Ger Hayisi Be'eretz Nochriya, I was a stranger in a foreign land, probably Egypt. Lachkor l'chapes darchei Tushia, that I was searching out the ways of the truth. I was searching out what the right thing to do was religiously. The era ben Adas Yehudiya, I saw among the Jewish people, Adam Chaser Lev To'em Mipluliya, a person who is complete idiot, basically, lacking in any judgment. Or completely erring in all his judgment. So really, really strong attack against Sadia. And this is a direct reference to Sadia Gaon. He goes on 2 stanzas later. Habinosi v'charati charada. I understood what he was doing and I had developed this intense fear. V'tesa chamasi ka'esh yukta. I had this burning anger that like a fire was ignited inside me. So he's really, really angry against Sadia Gaon. And there are many other such examples that we can't get into. So he attacks not only Sadia Gaon, but the entire oral law in general. On Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, it says, Ga'ayat Beis Shammai al Beis Hillel l'chalal divreihem, Ga'ayat, the roaring or the screaming of Beis Shammai against Beis Hillel to undo their words. Begam Beis Hillel al Beis Shammai lahafech perushehem, also Beis Hillel against Beis Shammai to undo, to reverse their explanations. Zem mevarech v'zem mekalal beroshehem, one blesses and one curses in their own head. Toavas Hashem gam shnehem, both of them are an abomination to the Lord. So really very vehement attack against the oral law. So some of his claims against the Mishnah are the following. So first of all, how can the Mishnah be authentic if the entire Jewish nation didn't agree to it? So that's a pretty serious question. And most of these are very serious questions that today, Jews who accept the Mishnah and accept the Gemara still deal with and still have to address and grapple with. Most of these claims are not original to Salmon, but they were written very clearly by him, even though he probably got them from other places. So another question he had is, if the oral law is truly an oral law, how could it have been written? Right? An oral law by definition is oral. And once it's written down, it loses its orality. And that's a serious critique he brings. Since the Mishnah contains so many disputes and contradictions, how could it have come from God? The Mishnah is nothing but arguments. Every single Mishnah practically has on this opinion, so-and-so says this, and so-and-so says the exact opposite, and so-and-so says a third opinion, and another fourth one comes along and says, you're all wrong, and it's like this. The Mishnah is full of that. So since the Mishnah contains so many contradictions, how could it have come from God? Now, Rambam's answer to this question is that every time we see a machlokas on something, we know that that could not have been a law that came from Moshe Rabbeinu. And other rabbis have other answers to this question, but this is a question that everyone is talking about. That since the Mishnah contains so many disputes, was there one original that everyone followed? Was it recorded in the Mishnah? Is it somewhere else? This is a question that has been discussed throughout Jewish history. If God wanted it written, why didn't God command Moshe to write it? So, if the oral law was meant to be written, and of course, rabbis have addressed this, and all of these have rabbinic answers, but these are very serious questions. If the Mishnah requires an explanation, it couldn't have come from God. To me, that's one of the weaker objections, because even the Chumash requires explanation according to everyone. There are ways that Karaites explain various problems that come up with contradictory psukim, seemingly that different issues that come up. So the fact that a text requires an explanation does not necessarily mean it couldn't have come from God. Nevertheless, that's one of the challenges he raises. And another problem he raises is that if the Mishnah is part of the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, why doesn't the name Moshe ever appear in the Mishnah? Of course, the Mishnah is full of the statements of other rabbis, as we said at the very beginning, finished around the year 200. But no one from the biblical period is mentioned. It's actually not entirely true, because the name Moshe does appear at least one time in the Torah, in the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. But nevertheless, by and large, the Mishnah does not contain the names of rabbis or of Jewish figures before a certain time in history. So essentially, this is where I want to end off and kind of leave with the basic idea that emerges from this, at least as I understand it, and the one moral to take away from this maybe, and that is that before Sajigon came along and wrote all those critiques, as we saw in the history, they were by and large a very diverse, fractured group with many different opinions, many different factions. And had Sajigon done nothing, and had he said nothing, history would have turned out very differently. And because a large part, at the very least, a large part of what Karaites were writing in the centuries immediately after Sajigon were direct responses to him. And those direct responses, more often than not, created this system, which evolved and emerged and is still around today. So when we have arguments and disputes, sometimes the best thing is just to let it go and kind of be silent and not have any argument. Because when there's a fire, a small fire, and more gasoline is thrown on it, the fire explodes and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's kind of like fighting fire with fire. It doesn't really address the issue. It doesn't solve anything. But in general, this is a very short history of the Karaites and Rabbanites. There are many other figures that come up, many other disputes, but the central figure of Sajigon at the beginning is the one who really pushed it forward. And with that, that's basically all I have to say on it. If anyone has any questions for me, for Shawn, I'd be more than happy to listen. And if not, we can call it a day.
When he came to the United States, he would look, my uncle tells us, my whole family came from Egypt, and my uncle tells a story. When he came to the United States, he would look through every bookstore to see if there was, not a book on Karaites, but the index to see if there were Karaites were mentioned in the Jewish sections of the bookstores. And like just this last weekend, I'm telling you, like just this last weekend, he told me, he's like, and if they mention Karaites at all, instead of talking about the Karaites, it says something like they arose a heretical sect. And then he says, and thanks to Saadia Gaon, the Karaite, and it talks about Saadia Gaon for like 17 paragraphs and what he did, and the Karaites are no longer with us or were diminished. So like I think the Saadia Gaon is like an amazing spot to talk about this dispute, because I'll use the word lore, but in the lore of Jewish history, like he is elevated as the person who quote defeated the Karaites. I don't think that's true from a factual historical perspective, but there is no doubt that he is painted as the victor in this. And one of the things that's very interesting about this is that, although he is painted as the victor, and we can accept for right now that he is the victor, let's just say that, because that's not really central to the next point I make. Like he wrote a Sefer Mitzvot, a book of commandments, and his book of commandments is virtually lost. But Anan ben David, who people claim to be the founder of Karaism, his book of commandments, for the most part, survived. We have missing fragments and all this stuff, So anyway, just want to say thank you for just bringing some care and love for the people of Israel in this presentation. I think you did great. And just one note about two things about the critique of if the oral law is from God, why does it need explaining? So your response is a good one. The one thing I think is like underlying that Karaites claim is that the rabbinic claim is generally that the oral law is there to explain the written law, right? Like there's gaps and they're like, how do we build sukkot? What is totafot, right? All that stuff. And so if the oral law itself needed an explanation is the problem, because you're telling me this was supposed to explain the written law. Now you're telling me, oh no, there's gaps in this too. Like, okay, well, where does it end? Like that's more of the flavor of the Karaite critique. And then I'll also say that most Karaite sages up until, I don't know, today even, talk, like even the most recent, not the current chief Hacham of the Karaite community of Israel, says like all Karaites must study the Mishnah. Like now why? One, because there's interesting knowledge in it, right? But also you have to understand how the people around you think, right? So like if you live in America, he's like, Shawn, you should read the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, or you should read, in Israel, he's like, we should read the Mishnah and the Quran because those are the people around us, right? So like really understanding the thought process and of the people around you. So that's all I would say. Happy to take questions if people have. So
really interesting. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Shawn. And thank you for coming. I really appreciate you showing up.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe we have a few questions. Okay. Daniel, I've asked you to unmute.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I actually had a question for Shawn. I just hearing your explanation is very, very interesting. And you had said that and Avi, you also had said, that part of it is if the text doesn't explain it, like you said, totafot, right? If it's not explained, so therefore there's some fallacy or some logical gap because it's not explained in the text. So you shouldn't need this extra text to explain, right? That was the claim against the Mishnah. So then, but correct me if I'm wrong, but also the Karaites do believe that the written Torah is from God. And if that's so, how do they explain the gaps or what to do with the gaps that are there?
Yeah, I can take that. So the Karaites would say that due to the fallacies of the Jewish people, we've lost divine prophecy, we've lost the Levitical priest who's going to help rule on things, we've lost the kings that help decide these issues, right? So that's what the Karaites would say. So we have a 3,000-year linguistic gap that we have to fill. So like totafot is a really good example, right? So like what is totafot, right? There's several things that are given in the Talmud about it, right? Some people say it's like a combination of two words from a foreign language. There's one place that says like it's really like totefet is the singular of that, which is like some sort of band that goes around your head. And like, okay, like let's assume that it's a band that goes around your head. Like, okay, that's fine. Is it a metaphor or not? Is really the question. In that specific instance, the question for the Karaites is this a metaphor? And the Karaites say, yes, this is a metaphor. And there are four so-called tefillin passages, right? And the first one, it uses the word zikaron and says this is a remembrance. So like all of the other three that say totafot should be understood in a metaphorical meaning. So that's the Karaite way. Like, so how do you bridge the gap? Like it's impossible without understanding the linguistic and historical culture against which the Torah or the Tanakh was written or given.
So Shawn, just correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. What you're basically saying is what the Karaites do is they create almost their own explanation, which is needed obviously because there is no explanation. But isn't that just in fact what we're doing with the Mishnah, saying we're creating our own explanation, but it was handed down? Meaning that the Mishnah is discussing...
you were I don't want to say you, but like the common understanding from a rabbinic perspective is that God gave Moses a separate oral law that explains all of these things, right? And what the Karaites are saying is there may be wisdom and amazing exegesis within the Talmud, right? But to say that the Mishnah came from God is a claim that the Karaites won't accept. So
we don't claim it came from God. We believe that the precepts or the final understanding is something that came from God, but the discussion and the back and forth is not. Meaning the whole idea of the Mishnah is we lost basically, it's all I like to explain, it was all supposed to be oral tradition, as we know, and it's, so every father wrote down sticky notes. That's what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said. Everyone writes sticky notes so that way we can compile it. And just like you write a shopping list, it was all concise. So when you write a shopping list, you write, I need eggs and I need butter. And then 300 years later, when the Gemara came about, so the Talmud starts to look at all these sticky notes and says, what the heck is eggs? Is it large eggs or is it small eggs? Is it chicken eggs or is it ostrich eggs? Is it a dozen eggs or is it a baker's dozen egg or is it one single egg? And so we don't believe that discussion happened on Har Sinai, in heavens, and that was given to Moshe, but rather the idea of that you need 6 eggs, and even though the Torah doesn't say 6 eggs or whatever example, so the Torah doesn't explain that totafot is tefillin or what rabbinic Judaism believes is tefillin. So we believe that the concept of that it should be black and square and all that stuff that we learned from the oral Torah, that's from God, but not necessarily all the discussion.
And that's
Shawn,
I think you've argued away. One second, I just say, like, I understand your point, and I think all Karaites all knowledgeable Karaites understand that. But the fact that you even said that this part came from God, that it's got to be square or black or whatever part came from God, is something that Karaites will not accept. Like, it's not like there's nothing wrong with having a book of exegesis, right? Like, that's actually really important. Every word of the Tanakh is subject to interpretation. Literally every word. The interpretation has to be consistent with the biblical narrative. And the problem, and I use these terms in quotes, the problem, in quotes, from a Cari perspective is that you claimed that some of it came from God orally, right? And that's the part that the Karaites would object to. All the people coming up with their own sticky notes and all that stuff, as long as you don't claim that it's from God, then we could say, okay, you don't claim it's from God. I don't claim that what Chacham Moshe Bashiachi wrote or Elijah Bashiachi wrote or Caleb Afamdopoulos wrote is from God either, and we can just discuss it on the merits, right? But the problem is that you're claiming some supremacy of some of the paradigms. Supremacy meaning supreme being part of it.
So just to clarify, and then I know Avi wanted to say something also. Just to clarify, so when you're saying like that it's a zecher and a zikaron, all that stuff that you guys, that the Karaites believe for, let's say, totafot, so that you don't believe is meaning, but you believe that explanation is from God, right?
No. So the fundamental tenets of Karaite Judaism, right, is search the scripture well and do not rely upon my opinion. So like every Karaite, him or herself, is supposed to reach a conclusion, right? Now, having said that, there are some opinions that are so entrenched within Karaism that I think it becomes, quote, the Karaites' belief. So like, for example, Shavuot is always on a Sunday for Karaites. Why? Because it's Mimacharat Shabbat, and we think it's the 7-day-a-week Shabbat, right? Okay, so that makes sense, right? So just conceptually, we can argue on the merits, right? So like those types of views became like entrenched as, quote, the Karaite view. But like to say that, quote, Zikaron came from God, we would say something different. We would say the plain meaning of this passage is metaphorical. Here's our proofs of it. And whether I'm right or wrong, you can accept or reject.
You basically take it as Jewish.
I'm sorry?
You basically take it as drush, like you say, well, this is possibly what it means, and therefore it's meaningful to me, but doesn't necessarily dictate a halacha.
Oh, yeah. In fact, no Karaite can bind another Karaite from halakhic perspective, right? Like I can't say this is the answer because I don't have central authority over anybody. Now, of course, there's like community norms, and Avi, I'll let you jump in, but like community norms, like let's say the majority of the Karaites in this area believe that for Passover, chametz means vinegar or in wine and fermented food instead of just grains. Okay, well, you have to have a synagogue, right? Or you have a synagogue. Like, what rule are you going to have in the synagogue? Okay, you can follow the more strict one. You can follow the majority opinion. There's so many things you could do for like community norms, but like I can't then go and tell somebody in their household that they're a heretic and they got it wrong. I mean, I can tell they got it wrong, but like I should accept that if they're approaching it with honesty and sincerity, that their opinion may differ from mine. So yeah, it is more of a digging and a exegesis on it. Exactly.
So what I was going to jump in and say, Shawn, is that, and you can say if this is correct or not. This is something I don't remember where I saw this, but in researching for this presentation, I came across in one of the books. They said that Karaites are people who read the Torah and try to understand how it would be understood by a Jew living at the time it was given.
Yeah, so that's generally correct. I would say that is a fundamental view that like. So what is the plain meaning? The plain meaning could be literal or it could be metaphorical. But with the meaning we're trying to get is the meaning that an average Israelite would have understood hearing the commandments for the first time, right? So we're gonna have to talk offline because it's so interesting. We'd love to talk more. Yeah, happy to talk more with anybody. But yes, I agree with you what you said, Avi. Like that's the fundamental view is that it's not my view of like what does it mean overlooking the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco. It's what would the Israelites have understood in the deserts or entering the land or leaving Egypt, whenever you want to believe like the series of revelations occurred, so, or revelation singular, if that's what you live,
Okay, very interesting. Thank you, Shawn, and thank you, Daniel, for the question. Anyone else? Anyone else have questions?
It looked like your mom had a question, Avi.
Yes. Mom, if you can unmute yourself, I'd love to hear your question.
I had a question because you said that in the Mishnah, like the entire Jewish nation did not agree to this. Okay, does that also apply today? Are there also people today that don't agree to it? To my understanding, like the boys' curriculum in the yeshiva, one of them is the Mishnayos. So the second part of the question is, if there are people today, meaning the rabbis, that do not agree to the Mishnah, are there yeshivas that are set up with a curriculum that specifically does not teach Mishnayos because they don't agree to the Mishnah?
Okay, so great question. Today, I'm really throughout all history, all rabbis believed in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was the foundational rabbinic text, we can say. So once the Mishnah was written, all rabbis accept. If you don't accept the Mishnah, I don't know what makes you a rabbi. Like, if there's a rabbi who claims to not believe in the Mishnah, to me, that's like an oxymoron. That's like a vegan who eats meat. It just doesn't fit. So
does that mean that Karaite? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Anna.
Does that mean that Karaite don't have? And maybe this is should be directed towards Shawn, opposed to Avi. Me know the answer, but I think it probably is more just authentic from coming from Shawn. Does that mean that there's no rabbis in Karaite Judaism?
Mm-hmm.
I know that sounds silly, but like I don't. It's
it's a great question. I'm laughing because I love the question. In fact, so there are definitely communal leaders in Karaite Judaism. Historically, they've had many different names, from the Arabic Muallim, which means teacher, to the Hebrew rabbi, to the Hebrew Chacham, even 900 years.
It doesn't. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, so sorry. Just cut you off. I come from a large family. Sometimes I just do that. I don't want you to think I'm being rude.
No, not at all. My family's from Egypt. If you don't cut me off, I don't think you're listening.
I'm a triplet, so we'll kind of along fine. So when a rabbi doesn't, but it doesn't have the same connotation as rabbi does, because meaning a rabbi in Karaite Judaism, it's not rabbi in the same way as a rabbinic Judaism, it would think. So that means that you wouldn't go to them with like a question about kosher, right? Because kosher, a lot of it's rabbinic, right? With the stuff in the Torah explicitly is like, don't eat the kid in the mother's milk. Like that's really easy to avoid. Does that mean that Karaites don't have kosher as the rabbinic Jews understand it?
Oh, great. I love these questions. So let me just unpack this into two parts. There are super educated people in the Cari community. You want to call them hachamim or rabbis or whatever, and those people exist. But like, let me just give you one example so you understand like the role, and then I'll talk to you about the kosher thing. So maybe 8 years ago, the former chief hacham of the Karaite community, he is from Israel, and he was visiting me in Daly City. My synagogue is in Daly City, just south of San Francisco. He's living in Israel, visits Daly City. And I said, look, in order to set the new moon, the month, you need to look at the new moon that is in Israel, not the pre-calculated moon of the rabbis. not the moon in Daly City. And he goes, look, I agree with you. It is, you have to cite the moon, but it's not the moon in Israel that matters. For you, Shawn, living in Daly City, California, it's the moon of Daly City that matters. You need to walk out your front door and look at your Daly City moon. Don't rely on me to tell you I saw the moon in Israel, right? And we're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And at the end, he's like, okay, look, Shawn, I've explained to you my view. Like, that's the best that I can do. All I can say to you is search the scripture well and do not rely upon my opinion. Meaning, here's the then chief Hacham of the Karaite community is telling me his view in no uncertain terms. That is, I need to walk out of my place. I live in Pacifica or San Francisco or Daly City or New York and look at my moon locally. He's telling me that in no uncertain terms. And I'm telling him the opposite. No, it's the Israeli moon that matters, right? And but he said at the end, look, all I can tell you is here are my proof texts, here's this, and then you need to do what's right between you and God. Like, that's the role. It's like iron sharpen iron, give you the text, make sure you understand the historical Karaite positions, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm accountable to our creator for my actions, right? So like I'm not going to be able to say, the chief Hacham of the Karaite community living in Beersheba told me XYZ and I listened to him and I didn't investigate for myself, right? That's the kind of the Karaite view. And so the rabbi's role is to like help you understand all the views, right? That's the general view. And then the thing about kashrut, yeah, you do go to the rabbi sometimes for kashrut. So like, let me give you an example. Okay, the Torah says don't boil the kid in its mother's milk, right? Does that mean, so like, does that mean though that I can't eat it, right? It says don't boil. What is it? Does it mean I can't eat it though, right?
Huh.
Right, like, okay, now let's talk about that, right? What's the answer, right? And so he'll tell you, okay, Hacham Elijah Bashachi said this, and Hacham, and this one said this, and another example for you that's like not super intuitive to you, right? In the Mishnah, I believe the Mishnah specifically, but the Talmud in general, like if you count Mishnah and Gemara, it says specifically that you can eat, if you slaughter an animal and the animal is pregnant, you can eat the offspring that you find in the womb without doing shechita on the animal, right? So specifically you could do this, right?
I'll take your word for it. I'm not.
Yeah, in the Karaites,
That's one of the solutions that some have thrown around for those who think that shechita is immoral, which is a much longer discussion. They've thrown that out as a potential solution to killing animals in other ways that don't require shechita in a halachic Talmudic way. But that's
so you can kill that. You can kill if the offspring comes out alive, you can kill the offspring anywhere you want and eat it, right? Like that's what I understand, but it doesn't matter. The point I want to make to you is that the Karaite view is that you can't even slaughter a pregnant animal, right? Now, where does it say that in the Torah not to slaughter a pregnant animal? It doesn't. It says the closest not take an animal and its child in the same day. And so the Karaite view is that forbids shechita or slaughtering of a pregnant animal, right? And if you want to be like super literal, the animals that talks about slaughtering in a child in the same day, these are strongly masculine terms, right? It's like you could look at the verses yourself. Like some of them are kind of neutral, but like one is like strongly masculine terms. So like, okay, now to extend that by analogy to a female animal and a child. Sorry?
Osovas beno. Otoved beno.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. So thank you to extend that to a female animal and its child is a matter of interpretation, and that tends to be the Karaite view. Okay, so like you can't slaughter it, but let's say I do it and I find the animal, can I cook it and eat it? Who knows, right? Those are all things that are now like up to interpretation.
So it's interesting. So it's a lot more. In my understanding is your sort of. You can go to someone for advice, but their advice isn't binding the way that rabbinic Judaism, if you go to a rabbi, you're kind of bound to what they say.
Yeah, so I will set aside the like what happens in the rabbinic sense, right? Like I'll leave that for all of you. But yes, the part about the Karaites is correct. Their advice is not binding, right? It's like, again, there's community norms. Like if the community decided, hey, in this synagogue, you're not going to eat the meat of a pregnant animal. I won't, just because if I disagree with that, I'm not going to come in and slaughter a pregnant animal in front of everybody and serve the food, right? Putting aside that situation, right? Mm-hmm. Like where like community norms are at play, yes, that is correct. They can't bind each other. So.
I want to just say my brother Mordecai is leaving. He was saying thank you to Avi and to you, Shawn. And then
Yeah, I
my
saw that.
my brother-in-law says lame. He's not calling you guys lame. He's calling my brother Mordecai lame. So just like explain what's going on there. He's not calling either of you guys lame. That's just my brother making
Thank
my
you,
brother-in-law
Anna
making
and
fun of my
Zani.
brother. Just,
Thank you. Okay,
it's to see
so
something.
Yeah.
okay, so I think that I'm sure that we can have a much longer discussion, and there's definitely time for that. But I think that at this point we can call this to a close, and I want to thank everyone here for coming, those who asked questions, especially Shawn for giving his perspectives as a modern practicing Karaite Jew. Very much appreciate it. Next week, at the same time, we will be doing a session on the Christians and the Jews, and two Milchamos Hashem. It's going to be a double dip episode. One written by Avner Burgos, who was a Rosh Yeshiva who converted to Christianity and wrote one of the worst, most harmful books against the Jews until Martin Luther wrote on the Jews and their lies. Maybe probably one of the top 5 most anti-Semitic works in Jewish history, written by an ex-Rosh Yeshiva, a convert to Christianity, and the book of Yaakov ben Ruvain, who was exactly the opposite, arguing against the Christians. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Especially thank you, Shawn, and hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Shkoyach. Thank you guys.